Hello, everyone. I'm Sapna Wadhwani from the Indo-American Arts Council. We are a 21-year-old cultural organization centered in New York City, and we're dedicated to promoting the arts and artists of Indian heritage, showcasing the performing, visual, and literary arts. IAAC's Literary Festival has had the honor of hosting prominent authors, and today it is my very special honor to introduce Tripurdaman Singh, and Adeel Hussain, who are co-authors of the forthcoming book, Nehru, The Debates That Define India, as part of IAAC's 2021 Literary Festival. This book has generated significant interest for being an incredible read, and we are so pleased to have you both join us today. I am also happy to introduce moderator Rakesh Kaul, Vice Chairman of the Indo-American Arts Council. He himself is a best-selling author, and his books include The Last Queen of Kashmir and Dawn the Warrior Princess of Kashmir. Please join us in welcoming Tripurdaman Singh and Adeel Hussain and IAAC's very own Rakesh Kaul. We're delighted to have you all in conversation today. A very warm welcome to you.
Sapna, thank you. And I echo your words, which is to welcome Tripurdaman and Adeel to our Lit Festival.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
And Sapna, we'll see you at the end of the show, where we'll ask you to give a vote of thanks. So, Adeel and Tripurdaman, where are you based right now? Let's get the viewers oriented as to where you are.
We're currently in the Netherlands. I teach at Leiden University. TDS is visiting here, and we're in The Hague, which is the capital city of the Netherlands. And it's a very wintry, dreary day that is typical of much of the weather here for 9 months or so. But then you have a wonderful summer. So anybody who's considering visiting the Netherlands, they should do so summer months.
Well, and when we come to the Netherlands, we're going to now know we have a friend in you there, and we'll look you up. But how did you end up in that spot? Can you tell us where your life's journey began, and a little bit of a summary so we get to know you as people?
Sure, maybe I'll just start. Like, academics usually have multiple stops before they find a destination that they can call like their permanent home. That mostly happens in the form of the institutions where you do your PhD and you move on doing a postdoc somewhere, and then you move on to a so-called sort of tenure track position where you're based more permanently. So for both of us, that journey, or much of the journey, was spent at the University of Cambridge. That's where we first met more than a decade ago. And we have since been in multiple countries. I was in Germany for a bit at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Law and International Law in Heidelberg. Tripurdaman has been in England at the University of London, where he's still based now, and is going to move on from there to other places. I'm now here more permanently in the Netherlands at Leiden University, which is like the oldest university that we have in the Netherlands. And yeah, these are the trajectories that we come from. I'm originally from Pakistan. I'm born in Pakistan, lived there for a while, then lived in Germany for a bit, then in Switzerland, then in England. And Tripurdaman is from, as he can say.
I mean, yes, you know, I'm from India, and as Adeel mentioned, we met at Cambridge, where both of us did our PhDs, and Adeel moved on then to the Max Planck. But I spent some time in India as an Indian Council of Historical Research fellow, and then to London, where I've been a British Academy postdoctoral fellow, and still am. And I'm just visiting here on a 3-month sort of visiting fellowship. So I'm here for a few months. And it's been great to be in the Netherlands as well. So here I sit.
How fascinating! I read the book with great interest. Uh, and so, why don't we begin by asking you what was the catalyst for both of you to write this book? And I personally think it seems to have been very fortuitous that it was the result of a partnership between you, Tripurdaman from India, you, Adeel from Pakistan. Only the two of you partnering together could have produced such a remarkable work of history and also a story. So I'm very curious, what was the genesis of this book?
I think, it helps that both of our research interests align. So, Nehru straddles both of our research interests, and he's a figure that both of us have been interested in. And a lot of things came together. I mean, the first was that over the last few years, all of these debates have suddenly become germane again. They've reemerged in public discourse in a kind of very strong way. So whether it's the question of religion in public life, whether it's the question of Muslim political rights and political representation, whether it's foreign policy in China, and equally whether it's civil liberties. So all of these questions have suddenly re-emerged over the last few years in India very spectacularly. And given that both of our interest kind of focuses on those subjects, we thought it would be interesting to join forces, really, bring our own kind of distinctive perspectives together, and then look at Nehru in a way that he has not really been looked at before. And that is in conversation with his contemporaries, with whom he was forced to engage. That's how his thought and that's how his ideas really developed and came to kind of become powerful in the public realm. And maybe Adeel might want to add something to that.
There's not much to add, but I would maybe just like to say that it's kind of meant as an introduction and an invitation to people to partake in what we consider to be the key debates. Now, Nehru has been studied by hundreds of people before. There's hundreds of books already written on him. So our main purpose was to say that, well, if we look at Nehru through his debates that he had with the key political figures around that time, then what kind of Nehru emerges? And that Nehru, we do feel, is very relevant for contemporary politics, because the debates that Nehru is engaging with have returned with a vengeance. And they've returned both in India and they've returned in Pakistan. And that's why we wanted to write this book, and that's why we wanted to get it out there in the public.
And I agree with both of you wholeheartedly. There is certainly Nehru on Nehru. There is certainly the admirers of Nehru with their hagiographies. There is certainly the detractors who are on Nehru. But the Nehru that emerges, engaged in debate, is a very unique perspective. And so why don't we dive into those debates? And let's start with the first debate. Tripurdaman, you talked about the Hindu-Muslim relationship and the debates that the engagement between Nehru and Iqbal. Maybe you could share a little bit about the fact that they did have some commonality, not the least of which is one that Kashmiris. Jawaharlal Nehru was a Kashmiri Pandit. Iqbal came from Kashmiri Pandit ancestry. I am a Kashmiri Pandit, so I found the first debate fascinating on the subject of Hindu-Muslim relationships. Why don't you just give our viewers a sense of how both were trying to approach that point of view, that equation, and then how is that being debated today? Because I want to also, get an understanding of the long arc of history in the last 75 years. How has that debate evolved to modern times? So over to you, gentlemen.
Maybe I'm just going to jump in and start before Tripurdaman gives his view. So Iqbal and Nehru debate in the latter part of the 1930s. So at that point, Nehru is already like an established political figure. Iqbal, of course, has become somewhat of a folk hero amongst Indian Muslims, mainly because of his poetry, but also because of his political leadership. At that point, both, like Iqbal has already participated in the roundtable conferences, which were supposed to sort of map out the constitutional future for India. And both men have already developed a sort of mature political philosophy. And what happens is, and what is curious about this debate is that both men are lobbying for a position where he's saying that the colonial states should interfere to the extent to which he can, the state has to preserve boundaries. And he sees those boundaries in the theological principles, and he comes up with two particularly strong ones, Tawheed and Word, that he feels need to be strengthened in order to give life to a Muslim identity within the legal structure of the colonial system. And Nehru is taking the position where he says that, well, the state shouldn't really be in a position to say who can claim Muslim belonging and who can't claim Muslim belonging. Because Nehru fears that once the colonial states intervenes into that sphere that has for the longest time been independent, and where the colonial state has reserved any type of intervention that they would make into it. And he says that once we allow the colonial state to intervene, then the reform movements within Hinduism would also be stopped. Like no Arya Samaj would be possible once the orthodoxy in Benares would sort of clamp down on the transformation of religious reform within Hinduism. And what we would get is conservatism winning out on both ends, both within Muslims and within Hindu fractions. We would have a conservative opinion that would start domineering. And that is the danger that Nehru sees. And being a reformist at heart and being a modernist at heart, Nehru, of course, wants people to move out of what he considers like a conservative rot. So, overbearing religious symbolisms that are weighing them down and keeping them economically backward. So for Nehru, the debate is really about how to bring progress within sort of backward people. And for Iqbal, it is about the moral and spiritual uplift for which he would also instrumentalize colonial structures, colonial administrations.
Would you add to that, Tripurdaman, or would you say that's a good summary?
No, I mean, there's not much I could add to that. That's a very sort of on-point summary that Adeel has given.
So let me purely look at that debate from a debating point of view. Is it fair that Iqbal stated that there are 2 points that are simply non-negotiable in this debate? And Nehru did not have that hard a stance. Nehru was truly debating in the sense of, look, you try to convince me, I try to convince you, and in that exchange, whatever is the better outcome, we both try to convince each other. So Iqbal was the harder negotiator, right?
I mean, I wouldn't really say that the harder or softer negotiator is like the best lens to look through this debate, because Iqbal comes to the debate as a believer. So he believes in specific religious structures that he thinks are non-negotiable. Now, on the other hand, Nehru also has non-negotiable beliefs that he thinks are beyond discussion. So Nehru is not putting his modernism, his secularism up for discussion. Now, that is, secularism is more inclusive when it comes to other positions that are challenging theology, then that is not really being soft in the general sense, but that is just because that is not a point that he's trying to implement. Like, he's in general open to different religions simply because he says that both of them are more or less regressive and are keeping people back. So the position that Nehru is pushing is that there is not much of a difference between the conservative Muslim position and the conservative Hindu position. So he's saying that, well, these are all conservatives of the world and they're now uniting in regressive legal demands. And those demands are, let's exclude reformist movements. Let's keep age of consent regarding marriage as low as we possibly can, because it corresponds to our religious belief. And for Nehru, both of these positions are, in a sense, not good for the people of India. But that doesn't mean that Nehru doesn't have commitments that he's unwilling, that he's willing to sacrifice. And he has them both within the historical materialism that he's into as a general structure through which time passes and history evolves, and also the very stark idea that the only way India can get peace is through material redistribution. So by the rich sort of giving up like whatever positions and material wealth they have and distributing it to the poor, that is the way in which sort of India will progress in the 21st century. Now, he's not willing to sort of make any or to have any other position, like say a capitalist or colonial position to work alongside his very firm belief in that structure. So if we are talking about religious belief alone, that yes, Nehru appears soft because that's not really the battlefield in which he wants to push his ideology forward. Whereas for Iqbal, it's only first with the moral uplift that we can acquire any type of material uplift of a people. So they just have a different sequence, right? So for Iqbal, the sequence is religion first, economy will follow. For Nehru is economy first and religion doesn't matter, because once people are wealthy enough, they see through the ideological veil that religion is trying to push on them.
You're so right. One of the things that comes clearly through is that Nehru was very concerned about backwardness for India generally, and Muslim backwardness specifically. So that was what he was trying to solve. So let's wrap the first debate in terms of what has it morphed into today? Do you see some of Nehru's fears being realized, in the sense that he was very concerned that if these gates were open, then Hindu or conservatism would rise also? And I mean, we're beginning to see some signs of that. But I'm curious from your perspective, as you look at this debate, what is its modern avatar? Who are some of the people who are duking it out on both sides of the Hindu-Muslim debate today?
I mean, so Nehru was very worried that there would be what he called heresy hunts. And you very much see this both in India and in Pakistan, where you do have, not only blasphemy laws, which are now being used as a kind of tool to silence dissent, but also which are very much now used as a tool to defend a particular kind of particular type of religious orthodoxy. So we definitely have what Nehru feared, which was heresy hunts. On the other hand, we've also have what Iqbal feared, which is that actually once you take away, once modernity kind of intrudes into that sort of religious sphere, and there is splintering of social solidarity, then you also have large-scale social violence. And so we've, in a way, we have both in both sides of the border, and that kind of what makes this debate so germane and so relevant is that actually consensus is still elusive, and it's elusive on either side.
And maybe just to add to that, Nehru's misrecognition of the importance of religion when it comes to the construction of political identities in South Asia is something that has played out in very, very many ways. I mean, it played out in 1947 when the split happened with partition, of course. And then again, it happened with the splintering of the more orthodox forces, the Mahasabha forces from the Congress Party.
Yeah.
And then with the rise of the BJP and other sort of identitarian parties, that are pushing for Hinduism. So the very misrecognition of the value of religion, I do think, is something that has continued to inform most political debates in the Indian subcontinent, well beyond India.
So we'll very quickly segue into that second debate, which is very much concerned about what you just said, Adil. But I want to wrap up the first one, and I'm going to be provocative and say, only to get your reaction. Did, with the passage of time, both Iqbal and Nehru prove to be right, in the sense that Nehru proved to be right that by traveling on the constitutional secular pathway, India seems to have, relative to Pakistan, made progress on the backwardness issue. So in that sense, his way of life, his vision seems to have turned out to be right. On the other hand, Iqbal's reading of the role of religion in Muslim life, their need for solidarity, seems to also be right. And one evidence of that is a most peculiar phenomena that see Indian Muslims who migrate outside India, there is very little cultural association with Indian Hindus. They mostly associate socially with Muslims from Pakistan and other parts of the world. And so maybe Iqbal was right in reading his constituency. So did they both have partial truths that they were reading and trying to, uh, lead with?
I mean, I guess the beauty about history is that in retrospect, one can always look back and then see and appreciate the partial truth. And I would agree with you. I would say that, yes, both of them were right to some extent, and both of them misread the situation to some extent. If we look at, so the important thing when we are talking about the intervention, the heresy intervention that Iqbal asked for and that Nehru sort of fought back, it's very much about the state. So Iqbal is asking the state to step in to regulate theological questions, whereas Nehru is saying that the moment we mix the state with religion, anything is possible, right? So you could have heresy hunts, etc. Now Iqbal is saying that the importance of the state in stepping in and regulating that is that it could build specific national identities. So people could have a political imagination that unites them. And Nehru is saying that that is not really important. Like, it's not so much important because the real issue is an economic issue. It's an issue of backwardness. It's an issue of lifting people out of poverty. Now, it's very understandable looking back to say that by the time they're having this argument, most Indians live in abject poverty. Like 90%, according to some statistics, others say it may be even more, are living in abject poverty. The colonial state has exploited whatever they could find in India and try to ship it back to the mainland, as has often been the case in late colonialism. So here's a country that is deeply impoverished, and both of these men are trying to do good by pressing their ideological vision on the people of India in order to lift them out of poverty. So even Iqbal's main deal still has to do with how to alleviate poverty. They're only having different approaches, and both of them are partly right and partly lead to the great catastrophe that we have in 47.
But let's move to the second debate, which was about political imagination revolving around religion or the lack thereof, and the religious fratricide and catastrophe of 1947. Why don't you take our viewers, Adeel, through that second debate? Who were the principals there, and what were they arguing about?
I mean, just to begin with this, I mean, the catastrophe was really the violence. The catastrophe is never if other states are born out of an already existing state. That is a process that happens and has happened in the history of mankind many, many times. So the tragedy of partition was really the violence, like that hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the process of separation. When we look at the debate that we have with Jinnah and Nehru, we see the very frostiness with which Jinnah is reacting to the outrageous, or one could say outrageous, that Nehru is pushing him to state his case for Indian Muslims. Now, this is happening at a time when Jinnah has already articulated the case for Indian Muslims many times over. And Nehru sort of asking Jinnah to sort of restate his case, and Jinnah's increasing frustration with having to deal with Nehru is really what we wanted to bring out in this chapter. So that these two men, both of which we see in specific ways, Jinnah usually seen as this cold-blooded constitutional lawyer who doesn't really portray any types of emotions and wants to solve the Hindu-Muslim question mainly at the table of high-level negotiations, and Nehru, the sort of charismatic, popular leader who wants to move away from the law and find like other solutions through which he can pacify the Hindu-Muslim tension, that is not entirely correct, because the Jinnah that emerges in our debate is a Jinnah who's deeply emotional, who's deeply committed to solutions that are beyond the sort of constitutional scope that has been outlined by the Government of India Act of 1935. And on the other hand, we have Nehru, who's sort of pressing for a very legalistic constitutional solution of the Hindu-Muslim question by pointing out, according to a very sort of, in a very legalistic manner, that point 1, point 2, point 3, and now let's Mr. Jinnah, let's go through all of these points and try to find a solution to this issue. So that is really the angle from which we are entering this debate, which is somewhat humanizing the sort of abstract, rationalistic Jinnah that has emerged in scholarship and in popular imagination, and on the other hand, also showing that Jinnah, at the end of the day, was a trained barrister who, when he was confronted with big political challenges, sometimes also liked to hide behind this sort of legalistic structure that he was trained in from an early age.
I mean, Adeel's gone through the major points, but the point is also to look at this debate as a kind of forerunner to what comes after. It's really, in a way, the opening act of partition, and as we say in the introduction, it's both of these people, in a way, positioning themselves in the public realm. So they're not simply debating ideas, but they're also, in a way, engaging with public politics. Because at the end of the day, this is correspondence that becomes that they release to the public, and it's very much a way of marking territory and seeing where staking out the field as to where each person stands vis-a-vis the other. And in that sense, this is very much the kind of opening chapter of the saga of partition, because it's the first time they sort of engage in this very direct, forthright fashion, and this basically is the negotiation that continues through the 1940s, with different people intervening and arbitrating on occasion. To really kind of come to a solution. But it's actually this discussion, here's where it begins, and we know how it ends.
So when I read that debate, I must confess that I got the impression that these two principals had crossed the point of no return, and that they were really talking past each other. And you're right, part of it may have been driven by the need for public posturing. Mm-hmm. But it was basically it seemed like the die was cast. That was, for me, a rather chilling read. That already by then, Jinnah was clearly feeling wounded. Now, it would come across in different ways that he felt slighted or undercut, but it was pretty clear that Jinnah was feeling wounded. And maybe Nehru was coming across as arrogant in the sense that maybe he thought Jinnah was at that time politically holding weak cards, and therefore he could just essentially dictate what he thought Jinnah should accept. But that was my takeaway from the debate, and I'm curious, is that really what was going on in terms of how the two parties were now seeing each other?
I mean, very, very much so, because Nehru did think Jinnah was holding the weaker set of cards, and you saw this play out in UP, where the Congress won an unexpected majority, and there had been an unofficial understanding that the then Congress President Maulana Azad had brokered with the Muslim League in UP, for example, with Tripurdaman and the Muslim League leaders from UP, and the idea was that there would be a coalition government, but Nehru kind of torpedoes that understanding and says, well, if the League wants to join the government, they're welcome to merge the party into the Congress. So there was this subtext very much that Jinnah was holding the weaker set of cards. But there's also a very kind of personalized dimension to this, which is that Jinnah belongs to a much earlier generation of Indian nationalists. He's much older than Nehru. He is objectively been a successful barrister. He's much more accomplished. He has been of a generation that Nehru's father was almost, and he was widely seen as the kind of heir to be someone like Gokhale. And very much the rising star of the Indian National Congress, someone who was tipped to really be the kind of next big thing. And then it's all kind of snatched from under his nose by Gandhi, and then Gandhi promotes Nehru, who Jinnah sees as this really brash upstart who has no accomplishment and nothing to really show for himself. And so there's I think both of those dimensions are quite important.
And maybe just to add to that, so Jinnah sees himself as representing the Muslims of India. So by the late 1930s, what happens is that it's clear that the British are going to leave and Indians are going to govern themselves. Now, how are they going to govern themselves? Well, through democracy. Democracy is going to be always more accommodating to a majority community, simply because the majority community can elect a party that is more according to its own will. And Indian Muslims fear that, well, there's more Hindus in India than there are Muslims, so therefore it's always going to be a Hindu-dominated government. Now, that is the big fear that Indian Muslims have. Now, how do you sort of deconstruct that fear? Well, normally by reaching out to the other side and saying we're going to give you any type of political participation, even though we could technically just govern and rule by ourselves. Now, when the elections happen, Nehru confirms the worst fear of Indian Muslims because he says that, well, the Congress party has won, so now we are going to govern, and he doesn't really take cognizance of the fact that Indian Muslims who've overwhelmingly voted for or to some extent voted for the Muslim League, that their interests are no longer going to be considered in independent India. So that is the big fear. That's the big sort of split that happens. And that is also what leads much to Jinnah's frustration, is that he feels that, well, if that is going to be the blueprint of how it's going to work out in a democratic India, then Indian Muslims really don't stand a chance in order to have their voice heard politically. So Nehru really plays into the bigger fears that Jinnah has, which also explains the somewhat frosty response that he's getting from him.
And just served by subscribing to a religious identity, and this kind of refusal to really take that identity seriously leads him to this kind of attitude towards the Muslim League, because he says, actually, they're peasants and their interests are the same as Hindu peasants, and those interests are being represented by the Congress and by, their idea of socialism. And so, both of these kind of debates really tie into each other, and that lead Nehru into a kind of cul-de-sac from which I think he finds it difficult to escape.
But a cul-de-sac that continues to this day, a fear that continues to this day, and what this was the first place where there is a stunning revelation. Many people accuse Prime Minister Modi of being a nationalist and wanting to promote Hindu Raj. And what was surprising was to discover that both Jinnah and Iqbal accused Prime Minister Nehru of the very same thing. They say, you know what, this nationalist garb is all about you want to create a Hindu Raj. And I think very few people today would know that accusation was being hurled at Nehru.
I mean, it's important to also consider like the historical context. So they're writing and thinking about this at the time when democracies have failed globally. They failed in Europe precisely for that reason, that there's always a majority community that has sort of tried to suppress minority communities, right? So that is the story of democracy in Europe in the interwar years. So when Jinnah is saying that, well, we are afraid of a Hindu Raj, he's speaking from recent historical experience and pointing towards democracies in Europe where this has sort of played out. So this is not an unsubstantiated fear that he has, but he's just pointing towards Europe and saying that, well, there's a big threat, and this is beyond Nehru. So that he's saying that, well, I think Nehru, you want a Hindu Raj, but he's just saying that, well, if we look at it, all the democracies have had to face this big question on how to incorporate minorities. And that question has in most cases led to the majority community of somehow trying to get rid or suppress the minority community. So Jinnah is making the case of saying that why would it be different in India? And there's different solutions to this problem. One solution is what Iqbal offers, which is to go back to that syncretic way where Hindus and Muslims has always managed to live together in specific imperial structures, be it the Mughals, be it the British or whatever. And the other is what Nehru is saying, which is the very modernist understanding of, well, let's all focus on our economic interests, and they are aligned. Like if you're a poor Hindu or poor Muslims, it doesn't really matter to you what type of government is ruling, as long as they're implementing good economic policies that will give bread and opportunities to both in equal measure. But it's very, very crucial to understand that historically, Jinnah is just pointing towards other countries where the democratic experiment has failed simply because the majority community has begun a form of nationalism that excluded minorities and then tried to push minorities out. In the most radical manner, this happened in Germany, of course, where you had the state-backed persecution of Jews, and then eventually the Shoah, the big killing of the Jewish population in much of Europe during the Second World War. So it's important to see it in that context, that this is where Jinnah is coming from. So his fear is not unsubstantiated. It's a fear that he's backing with recent historical experience that democracies have undergone and the failure of democracies has undergone in Europe.
But the tragedy, Adeel, is that fear which he used against Nehru, Jinnah was unable to do anything about that fear with the minorities in Pakistan. And he turned out to be right, but sadly and tragically for the Hindu minorities in Pakistan, right?
Yeah,
so it does beg the question. It does beg the question as to whether that fear, as when he weaponized that fear, whether he really used it in the best way when you look at the total India, Pakistan put together, the people? Was it weaponized in the right way?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to like the basic move that Jinnah makes, which is to solve the democratic paradox of what to do with the minority by Muslims from a minority into a majority. And then, of course, creating and producing this problem over again, where there's another minority that then has to be incorporated into the state structure. So yes, I agree with you that Jinnah is not able to solve this question permanently, because he also has to deal with or has to incorporate the very same governance structures that by that time have become prevalent, which is take the form of a nation state, right? So he also has to take the form of a nation state, which then happens in the shape of Pakistan, and where all of the problems come back in a new garb, where now Jinnah is in a position where he has to incorporate the minority communities. Now, Jinnah is coming from a position where he says that, well, in Islam, because it's at its basic, as one of its basic structures, it is egalitarian in the sense that all individuals are not already pushed into specific caste structures where they have to remain with relative permanence, but they all pray together in line. So therefore, Jinnah's thinking may have been that because of this egalitarian structure that is prevalent within Islam, maybe Islam is better suited to this type of democracy that the nation state sort of demanded in the mid-20th century. So maybe that was his thinking, and therefore he thought that minorities could be better incorporated within a Muslim majoritarian country than they could be incorporated within a Hindu majoritarian country, where Jinnah saw that the caste structure has been relatively permanent and has been reproducing specific elites from specific castes. And he saw that this big social, the big social question within Hinduism, which is the caste question, would also sort of further undermine the democratization in the sense in which he wanted it for Pakistan. So that would be one way of thinking about Jinnah that would allow for him to still uphold the demand for a Muslim majoritarian nation state to solve the minority question within Indian democracy, while at the same time saying that, he could not see the same type of incorporation happening within Indian democracy. So if one wanted to back Jinnah, that would be the argument, I think, to make.
Got it.
But I mean, also looking at it, I mean, Jinnah is very enigmatic on that question. So whatever we say is, a lot of conjecture, because unlike Nehru, Jinnah didn't really get a chance. He died very, very soon after after the new country was formed. So what direction it would have taken is slightly, is at one level always conjecture. But it's also important to remember that Nehru and Jinnah shared a commonality, and that was they were both votaries of centralization, and so they were both very uncomfortable with the idea of this kind of multiplicity of juridical authority and so on and so forth. So they didn't want power to kind of the center of gravity to rest lower with the provinces, for example, because that would really have undermined their stature as national leaders, which is what someone like Wavell wanted to do. So his threat was that I will actually transfer power to the provinces and make you irrelevant if you do not find a way of working together. So one of the reasons this conundrum really comes to exist is the determination on both sides, on Jinnah and Nehru, to look at it purely in terms of a kind of singular, unitary, and highly centralized nation state.
Yeah. So, let's wrap up the Jinnah episode. I would say, Adeel, in passing, that Jinnah's hands are a little bit stained about what happened in Bengal. But I want to now segue into, we can say Nehru had a blind spot about religion. Maybe who knows? Maybe he was wiser than us. Maybe he was right that we should not open the Pandora's box of religion in public life. That only the long arc of history will tell us. But there was clearly another big debate that dealt with a big blind spot, and that was the debate between him and Patel dealing with China. So, should we transition into that? And why don't you summarize for the viewers how both of them were approaching this issue?
So at one level it's about China, but on another it's also about India itself. And Patel sees a lot of continuities with colonial rule. So he sees very much India as the successor state to the British Raj. And for Nehru, there's an element, and in the same way that he looked at religion, which was to say, well, we should shed this, we should shed the past, and this is a big, brave new start. He also viewed, he conceived of India as, in a way, shedding its imperialist baggage and starting anew. And that conception very much played into this idea of how he thought of India's place in the world. And China is the most obvious example because for Nehru, there's no real dichotomy between nationalism and his kind of commitment to socialist internationalism. Because for Nehru, socialism by itself means peace, and capitalism and imperialism by itself sort of means war, conflict. So he sees that embrace of global socialism would, in and of itself, lead countries to peace. And as the first kind of country that had decolonized and become independent, Nehru very much saw India and also himself as the kind of big brother now who was going to show the little brothers in Southeast Asia and China, the path to peace and a kind of post-imperial society. So he very much welcomes the communist revolution. He wants to engage with them. He and the more they criticize him, because the communist position is that actually Nehru is a Western stooge. And that's the communist position both outside. So the Chinese and the Soviets criticize him for being that. But also internally, the Communist Party of India's slogan is "Ye Azadi Jhuti hai," meaning that this freedom is fake, that it's a trick that's been pulled. And actually, Nehru still represents sort of imperialist and capitalist interests that ultimately kind of go back to Britain and America. And the more they say this, the more Nehru kind of bends over backward, because for him, this position that he has as a kind of leading figure in the world as someone who professes internationalism, as someone who professes socialism, is something that's he feels personally attacked when Stalin and Mao accuse him of being this. Now it's interesting also because this position that Nehru has in some way also goes towards allowing India to play a much greater sort of, or at least aspiring to play a much greater role in global affairs than it's capable of playing, or than its material resources allow it to play. So in some ways, this image that Nehru had develops and cultivates is what allows Indian diplomacy to kind of punch way above its weight. So there's a kind of instrumental reason behind this sort of image as well. And so we have a position where ultimately Nehru really fails to challenge the Chinese position. And Patel's position is, outlook is very different. Patel has left foreign policy almost entirely to Nehru as a part of their power sharing agreement. And Patel has a problem not just with Nehru's attitude towards China, but also with Nehru's attitude towards Pakistan. And he also recognizes that having a problem with Nehru's attitude towards China and towards socialist internationalism automatically leads them into a position where they have to think about India's conception of itself when it comes to world affairs. And Patel says that very clearly, that we will have to think about our relationship with America, with and the Soviet Union and the wider world, which is because for Nehru, confronting China automatically means having to, since India doesn't have the material resources to do it, automatically means going some way in the direction of aligning with the United States, something that he really doesn't want to do, both because he really dislikes Americans, but also because that would validate the Chinese contention that Nehru is actually a Western stooge. And so that, in a nutshell, is where the debate kind of stands. And do you want to add something to that?
Just to maybe just briefly summarize, the important thing in order to understand Nehru is that for Nehru, the problems that India is facing can only be solved on the international level. Like, that is the main difference that he has with Patel, who does think that to the greatest extent, the problems that India is facing can be solved and resolved within India. So if one keeps that in mind and reads the debate, I do think it gives a good lens and a good window into all of the other views. Because if you follow Nehru and say that, well, in order to solve the problems from India, we have to solve or we have to engage on the international stage in a particular way, that everything falls into place, then his relationship with China can be explained. And
because also for Nehru, I mean, these problems transcend national boundaries, the problem of poverty and deprivation, but also they are problems that are caused by imperialism and capitalism. And so, as Adeel said, there's no real dichotomy between these two positions for Nehru.
I found that particular debate very painful reading. I mean, your heart goes out to Nehru. He is getting beat up from all sides, doesn't have any maneuvering room in that debate, even though Nehru is in charge of foreign policy. Virtually every argument that he makes seems to be a weak argument, and certainly the verdict of history has shown that every argument that he made turned out to be wrong. Patel seems to have more clarity, more conviction, and that was a very painful debate to read. And again, to some degree, it's very sad because Nehru probably did get it right. China at that time was a very poor country. China had its own poverty issues. Pakistan did, India did. Nehru was trying to approach the world or Asia with a very simple belief: let's have peace, let's work collectively together. But he couldn't make it work. He couldn't make it work. And that particular debate, I personally found it extremely painful. And I can only imagine what Nehru must have undergone after China and India had their conflict, and it probably shattered him. It probably shattered him.
Yes, I mean, with the knowledge that we have today, if we look back at the debate, it looks like the version that Nehru was presenting all failed to materialize in the way in which he wanted it to materialize. But then again, let's do counterfactual history for 1 second, even though that's what historians dread for the more than anything. But had it worked out, and had Nehru's approaching China and the brotherly outreach that he tried to do, had that worked out, and there would have been a third front that would have emerged away from this sort of bipolar world that was split with China and Russia, and both countries had worked towards economic progress in their own countries. And China may have been poor, but it's a rich nation in terms of innovation, and it has historically been. It has also been historically wealthy, like India. So therefore, had that unity really taken hold in the 1950s, Nehru would have been celebrated as the greatest genius who foresaw that two states and two cultures can sort of form this unity. So therefore, I think we're making it kind of easy to ourselves if we sort of look back and then say, well, it all failed and poor Nehru. But had it worked out, he would have been celebrated as possibly one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century. And it could have even, right? I mean, if we look at it, while it didn't, I do think that there's also a really good case to be made for the way in which Nehru approached his relationship with China. And I'm sure TDS would want to, or Tripurdaman would want to add to that.
I mean, there is. So in a sense, it was a diplomatic gamble. And one would have to admit that Nehru was also aware that it was a diplomatic gamble. So he was not, he wasn't delusional entirely. He was very much aware that it was a gamble. He was also very much aware that they didn't have the material power to really challenge, for example, China's intentions in Tibet. But he was also hamstrung by the fact that he associated India's position in Tibet as something that had developed courtesy, imperialism, and colonialism, and so for that way he couldn't look at it in the terms that Patel looked at it, because for him it was incompatible with his position, with his internationalist position. So that's one. The second also is that Nehru was also given very conflicting advice, and we quote that in the chapter. Is if you look at the kind of things that the Indian ambassador was sending Nehru. In fact, if anything, he was the one who was delusional, if that can be said, because he was sending back reports which were wildly inaccurate to an extent, and so in that sense, one can't simply pick Nehru up and say, well, here's this man who was deluded, because he wasn't. But Patel's position, as I said, was also not just related to China, because since Nehru was aware that there were material limitations, he was also aware that standing up to China and Tibet necessarily meant aligning with the Americans, which is something that he really did not want to do, both because he, as I said, he really hated Americans, and also he saw it as aligning with imperialism and global capitalism, which he didn't want to do. And because he didn't believe that there was any conflict between the national interest and socialist internationalism, because socialist internationalism in itself meant brotherhood, he didn't see that there was a problem. That's what led him to say, well, there's no possibility of war, and since there's no possibility of war, we don't need to, really think about it in terms of security. And because India conceives of itself as someone who's shedding their past, and so does China. China sees itself as, shedding its kind of past as well. Then everything is great. So he is hamstrung by a particular kind of position that if he was to, and that is also connected to the question of secularism that we were discussing, because the whole thing comes as a package, and because it comes as a package, it's also Nehruvian secularism is important, because that's what allows Nehru to kind of fashion himself as this kind of socialist secular statesman, and this fashioning allows him to play that role because at that point India is involved in Korea. It's involved in a bunch of places where it really, has no real material capacity to be involved. I mean, economically, it's poor. Militarily, it's poor. It doesn't have the material capacity. The only thing bridging it is Nehru by force of personality, and that is what essentially prevents him from looking at it the way Patel looks at it, because Patel's position is very much the kind of dull pragmatist, someone uninvolved in internationalist, projects, and that's where the real dichotomy lies. It's just, if I might stretch the point a bit, it's actually the real interesting thing in the debate is to see that actually there was no real consensus at that point, unlike what is often projected both in scholarship and in public discourse. There was vigorous challenge on that front to Nehru.
Oh yeah, that it's a great debate, and you brought it to the fore. I do agree with you, Adil, that Nehru's gambit, based on the greater good, uh, uh, was a missed opportunity for Asia, and historians like you will assign responsibility as to who sabotaged it. But I do agree with you. If Nehru's gambit had worked, Asia today would be in a very different place, and I think we are all the poorer that that for whatever reasons it didn't work, and so we were reduced to Patel's, more modest vision of let's look out for ourselves. So, but I thank you, Adil, for pointing that out, because we do look to our leaders to think big. Nehru was thinking big, and sadly, that was a historic miss for Asia. So let's move to the last debate, which is the most surprising, because nowadays there are sedition laws being invoked left and right. There's all kinds of debates happening that have moved into the Supreme Court. But it turns out that this all had its genesis very early, right after India became independent, the First Amendment, and Nehru was spearheading it. You want to just quickly, because we're running a little bit over time, summarize that debate?
I mean, in a nutshell, it's basically what's happening is that Nehru, as we mentioned so many times before, has a particular vision, and it's driven by the idea that the fundamental problems are economic, and the solution to them is socialism. So this Nehruvian socialism rests on two pillars. When one is redistribution of land, zamindari abolition and redistribution of land. The second is a particular type of community-based social justice or reservations. And both of those things are stymied in the courts. Zamindari abolition is upheld even though it's not declared unconstitutional. Some Zamindari abolition acts, particularly in Bihar, are checked by the court, so things don't unfold quickly as Nehru wants them to. And reservations are actually declared unconstitutional. And of course, as you mentioned, what was happening in Bengal, because the kind of tragedy of Bengal then plays into Indian politics, and Nehru is criticized in scathing terms. And he sees this criticism basically as what he calls an attempt to bully him into taking military action against Pakistan, which is again something that he doesn't want to do. So all three things really kind of come as part of an intertwined package, and Nehru's solution really is to amend the constitution to allow laws like sedition, but also other press control acts, etc., to control public discourse, and to basically make judicial challenge to land reform and zamindari abolition impossible, and also to constitutionally validate community-based affirmative action or reservations. So that's in a nutshell, that's what the argument is about. Zamindari abolition is not very controversial because there's a consensus. So everybody is for zamindari abolition. It's merely technical matters. Some want greater compensation, some want lesser compensation. The real fight is actually over freedom of speech. That's what kind of triggers the most protracted sort of conflict, and over the process of amending the constitution, because ultimately this is a provisional and indirectly elected parliament. So the real fight is over freedom of speech and over the process of amending the constitution, on overturning judicial verdicts. And this squaring off is really interesting because Shah Prasad Mukherjee is later the founder of the Bharatiya Jansangh, the forerunner of the BJP, and his views, in many ways mirror the views of those who would be, described as being on the left today, and that is opposition to sedition, opposition to restrictions on freedom of speech, and opposition also to a kind of more untrammeled vision of executive supremacy that Nehru represents.
That whole thing was full of surprises, and you touched on it at the end, that many of these issues that the left is championing today were originally, championed by Shama Prasad Mukherjee, in a sense, the founder of modern day BJP. Look, what can I say? I think both of you have done a seminal service to the Twitterati generation of today, in the sense that you put a source book that's very easy reading, and you've been very non-judgmental. You let Nehru and his four principal opponents come through in their own words with a very light editorial brush. I think that this book will become a reference book for anyone who wants to understand how India as a society was seeking to define itself, has evolved. For that, I truly, on behalf of IAC, want to thank you. And we very much hope that when circumstances change, that we can host you in New York City and continue the conversation in person, because these are conversations that are here and now, but it sure is great to see where they all started. So I'll give you both the ending comment, whatever is the last thing you want viewers to take, and then I'll ask Sapna to come in and give us a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Rakesh, for your kind words. Maybe just briefly, because we talked about the onslaught of Nehru in the Indian constitutional setting, particularly with the First Amendment. I do want to sort of bring up like a short, like a brief thing that from many of these anti-colonial leaders who led nation states into existence. Nehru was one. There were others in Africa and Southeast Asia. Most of them went full-on dictatorial after a couple of years. So particularly when the leader was popular, they just declared the country to be a dictatorship out of national interest, etc. So even though Nehru didn't live up to the pristine heights of constitutionalism as one would want him to, but at the end of the day, he also didn't fall as badly as other anti-colonial heroes. So I would just like to sort of bring that up, because what we see on the other side happening in Pakistan is, of course, a much stronger executive powers that are sort of centralized, and constitutions that are being abandoned. And we see that in many other countries in Southeast Asia and in Africa as well. And that doesn't happen to India, even though the constitution is seriously rocked by the First Amendment.
Yes, and just to wrap up, I mean, first, thank you very much for having us. And as Adeel mentioned, part and parcel of why we wrote this book is to present a very humanized portrayal of Nehru, and I hope we have gone in some direction, and succeeded to some extent in doing that. And I hope everyone just does read this book with that in mind, because the Nehru that emerges from its pages is a complex figure, very much a part of his time, and also very humanized as someone who is, also subject to the forces of history and to the kind of arguments that are being made on the other side. He's very much just there, and he has to play the cards that he's been dealt, and he also has to essentially, play against the cards that the others have been dealt or are laying on the table. And so, that's very much our intention, and I hope that comes across in the book, and I hope people enjoy it.
You're so right. Sapna just sent me a message. She's having some technical difficulty, so I'll do the vote of thanks. But you're so right. Nehru does get humanized in a very unique way in this book, but interestingly, so does everybody else. Jinnah and Vallabhbhai Patel and Mukherjee. So it is a very a fascinating story. I said it's both history, but it's also story. And I personally would say that for any student of India, whether in India or Pakistan or Asia or America or London or Cambridge or Oxford, this is a must read. This is a must read. I do want to give a shout out to Preeti for connecting us. Otherwise, we would have never known about this book. And but that's what good curators do. They connect IAAC with great authors such as yourself. We look forward to your continued scholarship. Keep it up, and we will look forward to our next meeting, either virtually or in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much.